Many political writers and analysts look at midterm elections as a sort of referendum on a president's successes. In 2006, there was a Democratic wave that took over Congress, and George Bush put this electoral victory, or rather a electoral defeat for him, as a sort of shellacking. In 2014, more recently, Barack Obama simply said, "We got beat." Looking at these two together, they fundamentally say the same thing. The president has to suffer the consequences of his victory by being reelected, which means that ultimately the party that is in power in the White House is actually going to see a decline in influence towards the end of that second administration. Now Barack Obama has to face not only a Republican-controlled Congress, which he's very familiar with, but he also has to experience a Republican-controlled Senate, which is something entirely different. So looking at these two together, we need to realize that both Barack Obama and George Bush had it right, that they took a shellacking and now they need to deal with it. The Atlantic reported on CBS News yesterday, Mitt Romney said that Barack Obama needs to learn the lessons of this most recent midterm election. However, we have to ask ourselves what exactly that lesson is, and Republicans need to ask themselves the same thing. When looking at today's question of what lesson should Republicans take away from the 2014 midterms, the answer is that they can look at two things. First, they can look at the intricacies of the ground game in terms of not only looking at the states in play, but also looking at the people in play and the issues that are going to make it happen. Second, they need to realize that when it comes to actually having a good groundwork and a good ground campaign, they need to understand that this starts in local offices, but those local offices are going off of how to respond to what's going on in Washington. So the people that have been put in place in Washington need to actually bring those issues back to Washington and make them matter to voters through their dialogue on the news over the next 2 years. We're going to look at not only the ground game, but also the issues that are going to make Republicans ultimately try to galvanize more support, not only among their top donors, but also among the rural, middle class, blue-collar workers that ultimately they need in order to win the 2016 election. It's not just going to be about money. Ultimately, it has to be about voter turnout. So when looking at the ground game, we need to realize that there are a few things that Republicans need to pay attention to. And so far, it seems that what they paid attention to in 2014 isn't necessarily going to guarantee them an electoral victory in 2016 because of the difference of the campaign. Politico reported this Saturday that the Republicans are actually facing a numbers problem. In 2012, Republican pollsters actually projected that Mitt Romney would actually win the presidential election. Of course, we know he didn't. Barack Obama actually won by a mandate, which is actually a more than 5% difference between elections. So Barack Obama had a mandate in 2012, even though Republican pollsters projected he wouldn't. The opposite problem is actually the case here for Republicans today. They actually projected that they actually were more conservative in their projections of Republican electoral victories in 2014. They were actually incorrect. When looking at the margin of error, we need to realize that the Republican races that were within the margin of error actually turned out in favor of Republicans. This Republican wave was not actually seen by pollsters beforehand. So you have to ask, could Republicans have actually done better? And this is why Republicans are actually kicking themselves today. This is why Republicans should actually be kicking themselves instead of patting themselves in the back. While they were very successful in 2014, they could have done even better. They could have gotten just one more seat in the House or one more seat in the Senate, and you never know, that could be the difference between a minority and a majority. That could be the difference between a Supreme Court justice being elected or a certain bill passing. And we need to appreciate these differences when it comes to actually understanding what elections mean. It's not just about getting a person elected, but actually getting a person in power that's going to make the changes that you want. So when Politico reports on November 14th that it's not just about getting a person in power and it's actually making policy changes, we need to realize that in looking at our third point, it's all about the issues that Republicans are going to raise that will actually put them in a better position for 2016 in considering 2014's lessons. Looking more at the ground game, we need to realize that Republicans have other things to learn as well. States are volatile when it comes to actually generating voter turnout. The Washington Post looked at two different states in an electoral analysis just as an example of how volatile states are. On November 14th, the Washington Post released information which showed that the state of North Carolina experienced a 14% rise in voter turnout in counties that voted for Obama and a 4% rise in counties that voted for Romney. In turn, we can also look at Virginia, which experienced a 4% decline for Democrats that voted for Obama and a 2% decline for Republicans that voted for Romney. In looking at these, we need to realize that Democrats don't always show up, and this is a problem. This is going to be a problem in 2014, but maybe not in 2016. 2014, the Washington Post puts it simply that Democrats didn't feel like they had to show up because they didn't really have to vote for their guy. In 2016, this is going to be different, and Republicans need to realize that what made voters turn out in 2014 is going to be different in 2016. So in looking at these two states together, you need to realize that Republicans, when they don't show up, aren't going to show up, and when Democrats show up, they're going to show up in a big way. And if they don't, they're similarly going to experience a decline. So there's such a polemic difference. We need to realize that Democrats are actually going to make huge changes so long as they show up. So Republicans can't really point to the successes of 2014, either when it comes to pollsters lacking the information and failing to respond to it correctly. We also need to realize that the information that they're going to be dealing with in 2016 is going to be fundamentally different. Voters are going to behave differently, and the issues are going to be different as well. And the issues are going to come from Washington. Looking at our third point, we need to realize that the issues that Republicans have to raise should be all about the economy. Pollsters, according to The Atlantic, in an article published on November 13th, the economy remains the #1 polling issue for electoral politics and for presidential elections. So when Republicans actually, in the past week, have pushed issues such as Keystone and have pushed issues such as immigration reform, we need to realize that they actually converge to actually further detail a narrative about the way the economy is going and why Republicans want to be the solution to those issues. The Keystone Pipeline is all about American energy and the affordability of living, while immigration is all about essentially labor politics and social policy. Republicans are trying to project a cohesive image of what America can be through these issues. So when the New York Times reports that the Republican caucus is trying to push these issues in order to gain an edge for the 2016 election, we need to realize that it's not really that Washington is dysfunctional. It is, but it's still very capable of articulating certain opinions and actually generating that debate, which is why Republicans and Democrats can potentially benefit. They need to hinge on an issue and then carry it through. So far, we're seeing that Republicans are very intent on delivering on these issues, but so far, it doesn't seem that that's actually going to happen. So looking at these all together, we need to realize that the ground game is going to be different, that the issues need to actually galvanize support, and for those reasons, the lessons of 2014 do not readily transition to 2016 electoral victory.